Right. Okay, so first of all, sitting up, trying to have a little bit of weight in your feet, but we'll look at the posture in a few moments. Just rubbing your hands together and tapping over your face. And over your head and neck. One shoulder on your arm. The other side. Belly. And your legs. Okay. So sitting back. So most of your weight is now going back in the chair, and we just want to relax through that feeling. And obviously quite a lot of weight somewhere lower back, buttocks, that kind of area. Again, depending on how you fit in the chair, chances are your hips aren't actually in contact with the chair. So just see if you can pick up. It's quite difficult in the chair, but useful when we come to standing. The sense of your hips dropping back into a space. They're able to do that because you're supported. You're supported by the points of contact with your chair and by your heels to an extent. Just letting yourself relax into that posture. Focusing your attention on the feeling of dropping back. Maybe your breathing, the rhythm of your breathing, and so on. Feeling the movements within your body. One thing about the way we approach everything in Tai Chi has its sort of, if you like, philosophical origins, cultural origins, you could say. In the old Chinese sort of tradition of Taoism, one noted commentator, Western commentator on these sort of areas, a guy called Alan Watts. I'm sure it's a book called The Watercourse Way. And this is quite a feature, I think, of the approach that we take in Tai Chi. We often use the example of moving through water, but in a sense we move like water. So if as you sit there, you know, just maybe as you breathe, there's a kind of catch, or there's a point of tension. One of the things we want to try and do, it's quite difficult to explain how we do it, but it's to do with our intent, is to find a way of making the movement that goes around that block, like water would flow around an obstruction. So when we do any of the movements, you know, you'll quite often find you're moving an arm and maybe stiffening the shoulder. Sometimes you might be able to relax the shoulder or move slightly differently. It sort of slides around that obstruction. And what that would do after a while, if the obstruction is due to a kind of blockage of some kind, it will help to just wear away that blockage, like water wears away the rock eventually. So this is really to do with a sort of attitude of mind, that we're not going to push and to shove. And even when we're a bit more assertive, shall we say, about dealing with those blockages, sometimes you can imagine breathing into them, breathing out the tension. Might be an analytical thing of working out a different way of doing the movement. Things sometimes referred to as the fire method. In a way, this watercourse way underpins everything that we do. The intent is always to move around, to find the spaces, shall we say. So we begin that sense of allowing the space within the body by doing as much as we can to release the tightness, the stiffness, So now bringing your feet in, come into the upright position. Posture, our stance, is always going to be a key element in being able to release some of that tightness. It won't work for all of it, but the more we can find a posture that is supported, the less need there is for the body to stiffen up, to tense up. A little bit of weight in your feet, about a third of your weight in your feet. And if you can, if you felt anything like your hips hanging down, even though they're now supported, see if you can still get that sense of them dropping still. So the general kind of downward movement through your body, again, like water. And so your hips drop down. That seems to create a bit of space. Then your rib cage can drop, your shoulders can drop. And what we find is when we're able to release some of that tightness, and to start off with, it's often just a glimpse. We habitually hold a lot of that tightness, but every now and then maybe you're able to just release the tightness in your shoulders. It will clip back in, but in that moment when it's releasing, just notice that you're still supported, obviously by your chair, but really supported from within the body, especially your upper body when in the seated. So you can imagine your spine has been like a column going up within the body, holding you up with the soft tissue spreading out from that column. You could get a feeling of your back, including the spine, with a slightly denser feeling, the same kind of feeling that you're getting in your legs, your lower back. But just recognizing that when we are able to release that tightness, we don't just collapse. We don't need that tightness. Once we've got the good posture, we're able to release. And that's part of the aim of that first reclining posture that we use, to just remind ourselves of that feeling, like when you sit back in the chair or something like that. And this is one of those things that we very much want to keep with us, to stay with us as we go through the different exercises, and just remind ourselves of occasionally. So then turning your head. So neck and shoulders, very common places for stiffness, for tightness to build up. So again, as you turn, you may find a kind of gripping feeling or something like that. Sometimes just changing the way that you're moving, less sort of pushy with the movement. Sometimes a different way of moving or an adjustment of your head will enable that sense of water flowing around the rock, the waterfall sway. And the image of moving through water also encourages that way of moving. So this helps to generate a momentum, a rhythm within the body, a kind of movement of body fluids, the movement of the soft tissue, where we're 3/4 water after all, so it's not unreasonable to think that we might move a little bit like water. And it's a natural way to move. Hands in front of your shoulders. So we don't have to make ourselves move like that. We can encourage that. We can cultivate the fluidity. And as I said, this image of moving through water goes a long way towards that, but also an intent not to overdo the movement. So with this one, for instance, you're not madly pushing your arms around. You're just finding how far you can move without the straining. And then, of course, we aim to dissolve, to one way or another, remove those blocks. So the approach to dealing with those blockages, those barriers to movement, reflects again that idea of the softness of water. Going forwards. Terminology is difficult because terms like softness and releasing can almost imply that there isn't an effort being made. There is, it's just a very different type of effort. hands out to your sides. So there's a ball or pillar either side of you. Just letting your hands slide around that pillar. And so when we start to move like that, we're still using our body. We're just using it differently. And again, you might well find that our, afterwards we're aching a bit in certain parts of the body, often in areas of the body that don't get used a lot. Because when we intend to move softly, we tend to soften the big muscles of arms and legs and back. And so we have to use muscles that are often underused. Not just muscle either. A lot of the connective tissue is quite elastic. Again, there's that fluid movement flowing through the whole body. Bringing your hands up. We want to stay alert to the movement. It's quite difficult. You can get lulled into a kind of sleepy quality, particularly in the chair-based movement, of course. So remember, you want to bring your attention back to your body, really as often as you need to. When you realize that your attention has drifted away, go back the other way. Resting your hands. Easing forward, still without feeling of your hips dropping back. So there's an interesting line in a very old Chinese classic called the Tao Te Ching, sometimes referred to as the Lao Tzu, who's supposed to be the author of the Tao Te Ching. And it's often regarded as the root text of Chinese Taoism. There's a line in it, probably paraphrasing a little bit, that when the sea hits the cliff, it always withdraws, but it always comes back and wears the cliff away eventually. So we can see how that might work here. If you're a bit stiff in your back, you start to go forward. You approach that point of tightness before we crash into it. There's already a sense of drawing back gently. And over a period of time, we find that muscles extend out. It's as though the individual muscle cells are themselves stretched out a little bit. And coming back and then going forwards again. And gradually, as I say, we find that we can move a little bit further. Similarly, water habitually runs down, and a lot of the tightness, as well as the weight of the upper body, a lot of the tightness, the stiffness there, we think of it draining down through our body. Turning this time, so you go towards one leg, one knee. Then in the other direction. And swinging around, using movement in your hips and your pelvis to move your shoulders forward. And again, change direction. Come back to the center. Pull one heel up, then raise the toes and push your foot out. Put your heel down, lower your toes. Knees still quite bent. And if you can, just pressing gently into the floor, as though you're just stepping onto soft sand. What you want to do is just press your foot in so you leave a footprint. And that's a useful habit to get into doing. You won't remember to do it all the time, but gradually it will become a habit. And it just gives you a better contact with the ground. On the other side, when you move your foot, try not to sort of move around like this. Just push your foot out. There'll be a little bit of movement in the upper part of your body, but try and make it sort of between hip and foot as much as possible. And then bring your feet back. Just once again, give yourself a moment to reflect and work with your posture. Hands down to your sides and turn your hand palm out. Now, easing forwards, rotating your hands as you do, so bird folds its wings. Notice how much there is a sense of movement within your arms. Whereas in fact, you're not really doing anything much, you're rotating them, but they stay out from your shoulders with this exercise. It's not from here to here. The forward and backward movement is because your weight is moving more into your feet and then back into your head. And then hands facing back, going into fisherman castanet. Here, the arms do swing out. But something which is worth thinking about, and again, this will become particularly significant when we get to the standing, is that when you get to about here, the thing is to drop down and let your arms swing forwards. Imagine you were sitting on one of these big blue balls you get in gyms, for instance. So when you sit down on one of those, you compress it, but the sides of the ball push outwards. And so dropping down like this, particularly through your hips, can create a forward energy. Same is true going back. It's not quite as clear going back, so it's probably best to focus initially on the forward movement. Just an example of where the outward, the expanding movement, whatever the direction for that, is really an outcome of the sinking down. So sinking down is always the sort of number one principle that we would want to try and maintain. Fisherman castanet. And extending that principle a little bit so the arms swing out a little bit more. So they're resting on a ball and you're just rolling the ball down in towards you. As you start to come back through the chain of movement through your arms, shoulders to elbows, elbows to wrists, wrist to fingers. Next time, as you come back, turn your hands palm in, draw your elbows apart, feel your chest opening and closing. Pigeon spreads its wings. And in fact, the expansion alternates between chest here as we go back. As we go forward, the sternum pulls back and back opens across the shoulder blades. So this is pigeon spreads its wings. Changing now with the same kind of feeling, but a little bit more compact, a little bit more economic. So the movement forwards is really focused with the palms of your hands. Imagine it's pushing a wave or pushing the boat. Imagine probably the easiest thing perhaps is if you're going to push a car and somebody taking the brake off and that, and you push against the car, and it would pretend to be the palm of your hand down to the heel of the palm of the hand that was doing the actual contact for the pressing. One more time. Now, loosely fist your hands, come back. The hands going, sorry, your elbows going back towards your hips. I'll get it right in a minute. So they go to here, not here. The shoulder, elbow, hip is roughly the line that you're looking for here. And a lot of the backward movement is absorbed into this spiraling movement of the arm. It's like winding up a spring. And then releasing. One more time. And then you go forwards, turn your hands out, open your fingers, winding back. Again, opening and closing in your chest, your upper back. Once more. This time when you get back, turn your hands palm down, polishing the table, turning, sweeping forward. Feel the movement in your hips and your lower back. So again, this is very subtle in the chair, but I'm going to stand up, keep doing it in the chair, but the movement is actually, if you look from the back, I turn, and the hips turn, I push my hips back, and then I swing them around, and then I let them drop down again. So here, I can show you from the side. The same way. So try, again, it's very subtle in the chair, but try to do that. And then, so again, going back to that thing of the watercourse way, finding the path of least resistance. If we think about this movement as stretching the arms out, it tends to sort of lock up our shoulders and so on and so forth. Think of the hips dropping back, then it's natural for the head, shoulders to go forwards and for our arms to follow. Less of a strain. So some of that development of the path of least resistance comes about when we can just rethink how we're doing an actual movement. And then turning your hands palm up. Gentle push down, feeling the lengthening of your back, followed by the contraction. It's almost as though every space between every vertebra where the cartilage pads are expands just a little bit. The spaces between your rib cage expand. Maybe even thinking of each individual cell from the hips to your shoulders expanding and the spaces between them expanding. Rather than thinking you've got to somehow strain to bring your shoulders up. Once again, a rethinking into a softer approach, a more water-like approach to the movement. It's still quite difficult, don't it? I don't mean to suggest that all we have to do is think right. I mean, it is it has to be reflected in the body. It has to be based on our physical experience. Bring your hands out to the sides. Same thing, but a little bit trickier. And we can try different images. So I talked about a push from your feet and your hips. And there's always a kind of starting point in Tai Chi. But we can go back a stage, back a level from that and think about, well, what causes the push? And if you imagine in your belly, that whole area between hips and waist, you've got like a ball or a balloon. And what happens is the balloon inflates, like air is being blown into it and it expands in all directions. That's where we start to get that downward feeling of movement as well as the upward and outward feeling of movement. Might even help if you can work with your breathing comfortably to try that with the breathing. When you breathe in, imagine you're breathing down into your belly, filling up that space like the air blown into a balloon fills up the space. The expansion and contraction begins there and contraction finishes there. Changing to part in the clouds. So the most familiar movements can start to feel significantly different. Just need to apply a little bit of attention to them. Think about how we're doing these things. See if we can find a different way of doing them. Part of the value of repetition is you get a chance to exercise a little bit of trial and error. You won't get it right each time. Using different ways of moving, different awareness, different images. Sometimes just using different parts of your body or focusing on different parts of your body. And then dragon plucks the stars from the sky. Expanding and contracting through one side and then through the other. As much as possible, allowing and cultivating a free flow of movement through your body. So, and working with your posture, working with different images, thinking about, you know, are you moving too far? Are you habitually, maybe sort of when you go to lift an arm, pulling up the shoulder, those little things. Gradually unpicking the movement. One more time. Both hands together. And as I said earlier, you know, if in doing this, say you meet a kind of stiff point, a painful point in your back, again, are you doing the movement correctly? Are you sort of straining in your arms? Are you pulling your arms or your elbows back, for instance? That's very common. Can you just find a way, following that pattern of movement, coming up from that expansion in the middle of your body, that flows around that point rather than bashes against it? Same thing, excuse me, with the sideways movement. And then alternating between the two. So this idea of moving like water, of the watercourse way, encourages us to rethink, become aware of different ways that we can approach the movement. It's comfortable for you as you push out this time at the turn in your hips in one direction and then in the other. Finishing with facing the front and pressing out sideways. So 4 stages now to the movement, pressing up. The middle 2 stages involve the sideways push with your arms plus the turn. Then we'll put out. So an example of that watercourse way might be with scooping the sea, looking at the sky. If we think in terms of we've got to pull ourselves up, pull our head up, pull our arms up, or strain where it's really tight in our shoulders and our back. We go back again to that feeling of the hips dropping back, like someone's sitting behind you in the chair, grabbing hold of your belt and pulling you back into the chair. We sort of unfold upwards and expanding out. And it's worth experimenting. Never think that you've actually kind of got it, if you see what I mean. And then hands fisted. Grasping the tiger's ears. So just because it's soft doesn't mean it's weak. Water is far from weak. So this quality of internal strength might be said to be sort of like the strength of water rather than something solid like a piece of rock or something. Grasping the tiger's ears. Good. Bring your feet back. Okay, just rubbing your hands together. Tapping across your face. Over your head and neck. Down to one shoulder, your arm. The other side. Quite vigorous movement. Light on your belly. And before we tap the legs, which we will do in a moment, just pushing your knees up and down so you feel the movement in your calves, in your thighs, just warming up the muscles there before we go to standing. Both legs together if you can. I've moved this forward a bit in the preparation for standing. We'll do the tapping afterwards. We're doing both feet. And then from here, you can move your knees around in a circle. Just aware of the movement in your hips. And go back the other way. Good. And then tapping your legs. So again, although we do a set sequence every now and then, there's a little change like that, or as you'll know, or movement gets added, or the way we do a movement gets changed. Good. Okay. Now, standing. As always, use the chair for support as you need to. The thing about I said about not being complacent in a way about the movements. There's an exercise that I do. I still do it like this sometimes. When I first learned it, it was like this. And I first learned it in 1988, 89, and I've taught it really for, since I started teaching. It's been a standard part of my exercise routines that I've offered to people, and I've done it myself. As recently as a couple of months ago, I started to notice something about it, and it was just thinking differently about it, about how my arm came out. And I won't go into detail because you've not done the exercise, but it's just so, oh yeah, I could do it that way, I can think of it this way. And what I found was that when I get to here, and when I teach, I generally don't go down, whereas before I was getting to here and it was getting a bit tight, now I find I can move further. So always keep yourself open to this idea of rethinking things, of reevaluating what we're doing. So our perspective changes as soon as we make a change. It's like you've gone for a walk, and you walk down a path, and then you get to the end of the path, and suddenly you've got a different view of the countryside around you, or something like that. It's not that previously it was wrong, it was just that your perspective changes on it. So standing, and again, when we were in the chair, particularly when we were in the reclining position, I talked about that idea of your hips hanging down into the space. So if I stand like this, the hips are sort of directly above my knees and my ankles, but my knees are tight, my ankles are tight, my legs are tight. When I can do this, there's a sense of sort of dropping that takes place. It's only very slight. It's just a loosening, a softening of the knees. But that's what you want to try and feel. Hips, buttocks, lower back, hanging slightly. It can be quite uncomfortable. We're biologically programmed to notice that sort of space. It's like if you're out for that walk and you suddenly reach the edge of a cliff, you kind of go, oh, you're suddenly wary, quite rightly so, of the edge of the cliff. So there's always a little bit of that goes on when you first start to encounter this. It's like, oh, I'm going to fall over. The things that stop you are, as I've talked about before, the fact that our pelvis just tucks under. The fact that doing this helps our center of gravity to drop. And the thing I pointed out to you earlier in the chair, that actually when we do something like that, we discover that there is a source of strength within the body. When we stand like this, we don't notice it because we don't need it. When we do this, then we begin to get a glimpse of it. And as I've said many times before, it's difficult. So you might want to, just hold on to something, hold on to a wall or a table, so that when you get that little bit of tightening up, it says, oops, there's a big gap there, there's a space there, you're going to fall in, which is your natural response. We don't want to ignore that response, but on the other hand, we don't need it here. It's a very primitive thing. We know there's not a cliff there, we know there's not a big hole there, so we can just enable ourselves to calm down a little bit, to relax, and get that extra bit of sinking down. So now, just sinking down, bringing your hands around as though you're cradling the ball, pushing up and sinking. And then your hands coming out to your sides. And let your hands drop down and push up. Part of what helps us to release, to open in our shoulders and our upper back, particularly with that last one, is the way that we use the legs. I talked earlier about that expansion and contraction in the center of the body. To begin with, what we tend to do is we think of pushing down through the legs. But as we get more experience with these, we realize we've got that contraction, that compression in the middle of the body, which then expands, and it pushes both down and up, and indeed sideways. So once again, I suppose to start off with, we're perhaps overusing that idea of pushing with the legs. And when we start to get that sense of what's happening within the body, maybe using that image of the ball, the balloon in the body, then we're still using the legs, but we're using them differently. So once again, we've kind of adjusted our perspective on the movement. Do this one more time. So there's still a push down, but it doesn't come purely from the muscles of the legs. We've, I suppose, enlarged the range of the movement within the body in a sense. Now, 1 foot forwards, transferring your weight. And the same thing here. It's always good to think about the feet. Don't get me wrong. And I've talked about this before. The feet are very much part of it. It's, what I'm talking about is a kind of development from that idea. It is very important to work from the ground. If I want to move that bottle and I try and move from the top, it just falls over. If I can somehow just get it to move from the bottom there, it's much more stable. So we have to have that push downwards. It's more a question of where does the push come from. So when you do this, give yourself that moment on each leg. You sink back, you settle, you feel that compression perhaps in the center of the body. Then it expands, and there's a push down through the foot, and you use that push to push you forwards, and then back. Expansion is in all directions, but we know that. So for me, even after nearly 40 years of doing Tai Chi, I started in 1983, and literally this exercise is the third exercise I ever did. And it doesn't happen all the time, but every now and then, if we keep a kind of openness, an open awareness about what we're doing, we discover things, and our perspective on the exercise changes. So then we're less strained. As we begin to raise our toes and our heel, because we're less strained, we're less likely to be up here. And so the practical outcome is a feeling of much more stability. So if we practice like this, these become habitual ways of moving. And that's when they gradually make themselves felt in our daily life. We don't go down, I don't walk down the road thinking, oh, I've got a ball here. It's got to contract and expand, because that's not what you're doing. We're going out shopping or whatever. But we gradually develop new ways of moving that spill over into other parts of our life. And then on the other side. Raising toes and heel. And stepping in. Step through a little. and then in the other direction. So, fisherman cast a net, and I mentioned this in the chair. I mentioned about sort of sitting on a ball, or you could imagine that ball in the middle of your body. Basically, it has the same effect. I go forwards, and I get that sense of dropping down. Now, if there's a ball there, the ball the side of the ball will expand outwards, and it's that which pushes the arms forwards. Same thing will happen backwards to a lesser extent. So probably best to concentrate first of all on the forward movement. Once you've begun to sort of like discover these little qualities in some of the movements, usually the very simple movements, and this is a very simple, straightforward movement, it's one of the great things about it, then that way of moving, that approach to moving will start to seep into other exercises where it's not quite so obvious. So any image that I give you, any idea, shouldn't be sort of chipped out in stone. They're fluid ideas to help us sort of understand the experience and to change and to cultivate the experience. So this time when you sink back, turn and sink into that hip, and this time the expansion pushes your arms up. But even then, up is a bit misleading, because as your arms go out, it's sooner or later they're going to swing up because they're attached to your shoulders. But it's slightly different. The direction of movement ends up being slightly different to the one that we just had in fisherman cast a net. Partly because we're turning, and partly because it's a different exercise, and as we become familiar with the pattern of the exercise, so we can explore the internal dynamic more. Good, and then on the other side. So I don't move now in these exercises in the way that I did maybe a year ago or 2 years ago. I find this with my own teachers, and sometimes from month to month, like, oh, you're doing that differently, and oh, how are you doing that now? Because they've changed as well, they've developed. And I think that's important, that it means that the art remains alive for us. And then changing. And then this time, if you're comfortable with this, you just take a step. Now you can go in a straight line with this movement, or if there's a chair in front of you, you could change direction. I'm going to go in a straight line because otherwise I'll go completely off camera. You can change direction, so this time I'm going to step back. So this is quite a flexible exercise, perhaps reflecting that idea of water. So in your own space, in your own time, you can play around with this a little bit. But now just bringing your feet back parallel. Good. And shake out. Go back to your chairs. I sometimes get people say to me, I've had students up and they say, oh, a couple of years ago or 5 years ago or some time ago, 10 years ago, you did this. And it's always a bit embarrassing to say, did I? What did I do? I said, can we do that again? I'm like, well, maybe if I can remember what I did. And indeed, quite often it'll be something that was like, yeah, that was what I did then. I've now kind of moved on. And that can also be quite good, by the way. It can also be quite good for me to go back and think, oh, that's what I was thinking at that time, because that's also part of it. It's not just a case of looking forwards. There's a history to these things. But one noted Tai Chi teacher in this country who was very into the martial side of things, a guy called Dan Doherty. He's dead now, unfortunately. Quite a controversial character. As I say, he's very much a martial artist, and he developed Parkinson's disease, which had been in his family all along. And when I spoke to him at one point, he was saying, he'd managed to avoid it for quite a long time. But of course, that was a big change for him. Somebody who'd always been kind of into the martial arts and things like that, suddenly to sort of like have that happen to him. And in one of his latest books, one of his last books, because he wrote quite a lot, he described Tai Chi as the martial art of change. In other words, the art that allows us to navigate change. And of course, change is happening to us all the time. So that softness, that flexibility of the watercourse way means that we're able to take the principles of Tai Chi into a sort of changing situation. Change is inevitable, and we've seen a lot of that in the last few years, of course, but it's always happening, really. So just coming back, feeling your hips sinking down, embrace tiger, return to mountain, pushing up. And again, there's that natural flow downwards, like water flowing downwards, drawing you back, drawing both your arms in, your attention in, just that little sense of resting for a moment before we expand again. One more time. And rest. Lovely. And just open your eyes. Great. Thank you very much, everybody. So consider the watercourse way, if that idea appeals to you at all.